Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, about one of the OG survivors I've wanted to make a video on for months. The new player's best friend, Meg Thomas. There are very few constants in Dead by Daylight. New killers, new perks, new cosmetics, new bugs, new content creators hitting the scene after old one that cancelled on Twitter for saying something racist, homophobic, or just mind-bendingly stupid. But some things never change. Backbreaking twins bugs that never get fixed. Devour Hope's movement speed not actually existing. Ruin Undying Tinkerer Blight, insisting that a killer is fun to play against despite all evidence to the contrary. Haddonfield having a close intimate relationship with the task manager menu. But the greatest constant, I would argue, is the humble and inimitable phenomenon of survivor behaviour known as the Meg head. When in the lobby for a match, there is very little your average solo queue player fears more than a default Meg. There are good reasons for that. Meg's teachable perks are arguably the best perks for a new player with no DLCs. It's between her and Bill, so a lot of new players will start by putting their blood points into Meg. It is a truly fascinating thing to see the common or garden Meghead attempting to survive in the hostile environment of a trial. Here's one now, performing its natural defensive camouflage strategy, crouch walking in a dead dog bush as soon as they hear the hunter's lullaby across the map. It slowly creeps over to another survivor on a generator, confident that strength in numbers will help them prevail, and performs a ritual mating dance to signal a desire to rub its new partner. But in this, the Meghead makes one crucial error. A single failed skill check causes it to bolt, sprint bursting into a wall. This Meghead will not survive the winter. But just because the in-game Meghead is one of the most oblivious, boneheaded creatures that has ever walked the earth, does that mean that Meg herself as a character has that same problem? Of course not. Behaviour could not craft a creature of such stupidity as the Meghead. You literally can't make this shit up. Meg is one of the 4 original survivors that came with Dead by Daylight's initial release way back in the dark times of 2016. Back then, Dead by Daylight's lore was both comprehensive and at the same time extremely shallow. Everything in the game had a lore explanation, even if it was only a sentence or two. And even if it didn't make any sense or contradicted itself sometimes. Just like the other characters, Meg was no exception. The original 4 survivors, and every survivor up until maybe Adam or Jeff, were mostly designed around one trait, that's summed up in that little moniker they have. Dwight's the nervous leader, Claudette is the studious botanist, Jake is the solitary survivalist. They're not people, they're character archetypes without any depth whatsoever. But of the original 4, I found Meg to be the one that deviates most from a stereotype. Where the other survivors failed to exist outside of their archetypes as fully fledged people until their tomes came out, Meg managed to stand out as a character with just enough meat on her bones to be an actual character. Nothing amazing, but good enough as a starting point for future stories to craft her into a whole person, and as a benchmark for other survivor stories to come. As to how it did this, the answer is very simple. Meg's base story emotionally grounded her in the context of her world and gave us a reason to root for her. In short, it made her more than just an energetic athlete. But in order to properly evaluate Meg's base lore, I've just gotta say, holy fuck, you can really tell English is not Behaviour's primary language. Meg excelled in schoolwork, but she was off the rails. Is this the story of a young woman growing up, or one of Asimov's laws of robotics? This is meant to be a personal story, but it sounds so artificial. And, search as they did, they never found her body. Who is they? The Monopoly Man? Spartacus, son of Spartacus? The ghost of Charles Dickens? I don't know. It's just a very amateurish piece of writing if you break it down to the language and syntax. Something that is not uncommon among translated works. But I have to give some credit where it's due. Just because the brushstrokes are quite rough doesn't prevent the story from painting a good picture of who Meg Thomas is. Look at her primary reason for running. It's not just because she likes running, is because it's a part of her life that she needs to hold it together. While I'm not a doctor, a lot of people I've spoken to with ADHD have identified with Meg's hyperactivity that was channeled into her running. She isn't just a runner, she's an overly energetic, hyperactive teen who becomes a runner. And that's a far more compelling story. It constructs identity for Meg. We know how she'd act if we met her in a coffee shop. That being said, a little soupçon of character, a dribble of actual humanity, isn't enough to make a fully fledged person. There's a reason that stories of survivors with genuinely fantastic character, like Elodie, Zarina, Yui and Adam, have a bit more meat on their bones, and are often much longer. Because to truly see a character flourish, you had to put them in a story. And Meg's base lore doesn't really have that. Meg dropping out of college to care for her ailing mother is a great plot beat. We don't really get a sense of what her life is like after that, what she's traded her college education away for. It becomes hard to fully understand the impact of the decision that she's made when it's summed up so briefly. We also don't know about the circumstances that led up to this decision, the nature of her illness, Meg's relationship with her mother. It looks like Meg's mother wants to be a part of this story, the emotional catalyst that fuels Meg's character and makes the story take on some emotional weight. But all she is in the base story is a footnote, something to be left behind when Meg is taken by the entity. Don't get me wrong, this isn't a problem exclusive to Meg, and nor is she the worst case of it. All of the first 4 survivors do this. Dwight's entire character is defined by having 0 emotional stakes or insight into how he lives his life. Claudette didn't get any emotional attachment to the world that shaped her until her tome pulled her character out of the gutter. And Jake's story is overshadowed by a single burning question that took Behaviour 5 years to figure out the answer to. But more on that when Jake's tome story comes out in the next rift. And after Claudette's story more or less completely saved her character by telling a heartfelt emotional story that naturally fit into the Claudette that we already knew, I was optimistic that Meg's story would do the same. They had all the components they could have wanted to craft an absolute blinder of a tome story. We know who Meg is, why she is the way that she is, and we even have a major decision point in her life that merits further exploration. It's like a giant neon sign over the story saying, "Hey, put a tome here!" So what did Behaviour do? Well, not that. But before I go on, I'd like to say Meg's story isn't inherently bad. It's not like Nia or Nurse or Hag, where the stories are actively not worth reading. It's just, most of the story doesn't really do anything. From the weird hazing ritual where she runs around slashing tires on a police car, to the clique of underdeveloped flatfish that make her do it. Seriously. Meg's fellow athletes are not just the most boring part of this story, but you can tell that whoever wrote it has not met a teenage girl in their lives outside of watching Mean Girls one time. How many high school running teams have hazing rituals where you vandalise police cars? The students aren't in control of the team. Meg obviously doesn't care about them or their approval, and those are trying to get her kicked off the team, so why is she participating in it? I get it if she was trying to fit in with them, but she knows several of them don't want her anyway and are trying to sabotage her. It just feels kind of forced. Like the writer watched a made-for-TV live-action Disney movie and decided, yes, that adequately represents actual human interactions that happen in the real world. How do you do, fellow kids? Much of the dialogue is similarly painful. You'll eat my dust soon enough, wench. Hang on a moment. I don't know anyone born after William Shakespeare who uses the term wench in anything other than a purely ironic sense. Is this supposed to be a more vulgar insult that Behaviour censored? Is it a translation flub? Or do they really just not know how actual humans insult each other? The developers of Dead by Daylight don't know how people insult each other. Just let that sink in. So much of this story feels paper thin and without substance, like butter scraped over too much bread. You see this most clearly when you compare it to Yui's story, which is similar in both its structure and its themes. Both stories follow a racer who's rejected by those around them and prevented from participating in a race because their skills and resolve are not properly understood. But while Meg's interactions with people who reject her don't feel organic, everyone in Yui's world feels as realistic as she herself does. the story becomes believable, because every interaction that Yui has, be they with friend or foe, makes sense. Maybe it's because Yui is older, smarter and more experienced than Meg. Maybe it's because Hiro's injury partway through grounds the story and provides it with serious stakes that make Yui's participation in the Secret 4 race more important. The brilliance of Yui's story, as I discussed in a prior video, just goes to show even more starkly where Meg's story falls apart. Meg's ADHD-like tendencies are also not explored whatsoever. This kind of surprised me, given how quick Behaviour was to double down on the autism coding in Claudette's lore, which was received exceptionally well a year prior. This story mostly takes place in Meg's internal monologue, so the fact that it doesn't seem to reflect any sort of hyperactive mind makes it feel like an imitation of who Meg is always supposed to be. Like it's not really Meg we're reading about, but instead a regular, boring teenage girl who's using Meg Thomas's name and read her lore bio one time. But for all the problems that Eat Dust has, I can't completely hate it. In fact, I have a serious soft spot for it. A spot so soft that it drew me to making this video in the first place. And that is the same emotional core that made Meg's original story stand out from the 3 original survivors: her mother. The one way in which Meg's character is organically grown is probably also the most important, as we get a sense of what Meg chose to leave college behind for. Meg's mum is arguably the best parent in Dead by Daylight. I'm not joking, DBD's parents are often terrible people. Max and Evelyn Thompson, Yui's parents, Archie Macmillan, Frank's foster dad and Ormond, basically the entire Yamaroka family, all just absolute parenting disasters. Admittedly, there are a few very good parents. Zarina's father, Madeline Dehai, the mother of the twins, and Adiris' adoptive father Haban spring to mind here. But Meg's mum is absolute top-shelf weapons-grade mum material. When Meg comes in livid about the attack on her, her mum listens, does her best to understand what Meg's going through, and offers support without instructing her to do anything. She respects that Meg's her own person and capable of making decisions on her own, while still being an invaluable pillar of emotional support. And that's what makes this interaction completely heartbreaking if you've read Meg's base lore, or pay attention to earlier parts of the story. Meg's on the verge of losing her mum, and they both know it. Obviously we knew that from her base lore, but the reality of it becomes impossible to ignore in this story. Look at the very first time Meg's mum is mentioned, for example. Meg uses the analogy of the rib of the whale, and realises she got it from a story she shared with her mum. To a lot of people, that would perhaps be a story that your mum read to you as a child, but to Meg it's an inversion of that. She read the story to her mum because Meg is the carer in the household. Just a little twist on what we would expect a close mother-daughter relationship to look like, that makes it all the more tragic because Meg's bearing the weight of responsibility far younger than she should. Meg and her mum don't actually talk about the disease that's killing her in the scene in the kitchen, but as the conversation goes on, it's clear that Meg's mum is doing her absolute best to be the supportive mum that she wants to be, but struggles to be more and more as the sickness takes its hold. Meg's been forced to be independent earlier than she should. Her mum isn't there to help her when she gets attacked. She drags herself to her feet and limps home. That's not an accident of storytelling. In the big, dark outside world, Meg's on her own. And right in front of her eyes, her only light in that big, dark world is slowly going out. As a wise man once said, if you've ever lost someone very important to you, then you already know how it feels. And if you haven't, you cannot possibly imagine it. Meg's mum knows that she's slipping away before her time, and so she's trying to make Meg as comfortable as possible during these final days, because when she's gone, Meg will be on her own. Meg knows this too, and it lets us fully see and understand why Meg gave up college to take care of her. because she's not ready to let her mum go. Her staying is just as much an act of desperation as it is one of kindness. Meg is clearly devoted to her mother. She's always apologising and trying to take care of her no matter what happens. But there's this sense that behind everything Meg does is a mortal fear of saying goodbye. It's a fear that we all have. That one day those in our lives will say goodbye to us for the last time. And Meg has to face that fear every day. Be strong for her mum, because at the end of the day, the two of them need each other. That's what the gift of the dress is. It's a symbol of Meg growing from a girl attached to her mother into an independent woman. That's the future that Meg's mum wants for her, and it's a future that Meg might not be ready for yet. It's no coincidence that the last we see of Meg's mum is the hug. Meg clutching on in an attempt to hold her close, to never let her go, not let her slip away. And yet, at the race, she's on her own. Meg takes responsibility for her own safety onto her shoulders, because right now, that's what she has to do. Her mum won't be there to solve her problems anymore, so she does what she has to do, no matter how much it hurts. And this whole solemn farewell to a loving parent takes on a whole new level of tragedy, as we know that in the near future, Meg will be stolen away by the entity, presumably quite soon after this race takes place. Meg and her mum rely on each other completely, and for Meg to just vanish off the face of the earth must be a truly heartbreaking experience for the single parent she left behind. She'd probably blame herself, convinced she put too much pressure on Meg and that now she's on her own. No parent should ever have to bury their child. And despite her body remaining undiscovered, that's probably the feeling that Meg's mum felt when she realised her daughter wasn't coming back. And Meg probably feels just as awful. She'd be worried about her mum, every second of those trials, terrified that if she ever makes it out, her mum won't be there to welcome her home. Without Meg to look after her, how long does Meg's mum even have left? By taking Meg away, the entity has all but doomed her mum to die alone and miserable, believing her daughter to be dead and that to some degree it's her fault, while Meg herself is both fully aware of how alone her mother is in her dying days and is utterly powerless to prevent it. Meg's tone story and base lore coexist to paint us a horribly tragic image of a family split by circumstances out of their control. And it's not some fantastical eldritch cult or a cannibal clan that caused this divide. It's something far more real. Something that many of us will have to live with at some point in our lives. The tough reality is that, for as much as we love them, the people in our lives will leave us someday, and we might not even get the grace of a proper goodbye. It may be worth hoping that someday Meg will escape the realm of the entity and return home to her mother's waiting arms. But we all know that when dealing with terminal illness, hope is a hard thing to come by. Meg's story is fundamentally not well written, but I will forgive it because it gets one thing very, very right. For a game full of slaughter, torture and death, Dead by Daylight doesn't really treat death and its effects on those we love with any great deal of thought. Meg's story forces us to stare at our mortality and that of those we care about in the face, and dares us to break its stare. And for that, I have to give it some respect. It's a reminder that no matter what we do, no matter how much we love or are loved by those around us, death will catch up in the end. We can't run from it forever. Okay, sorry for the incredibly depressing end to that video. I still hope it was of some value to you. If you are interested in this sort of stuff going forward, then please do subscribe. I've got a much more upbeat video planned for the next episode, and that will be about the Crypt TV skins, so do pay attention to that one. In the description you can find links to my Discord server, my Twitter, and my Patreon and Ko-fi if you're interested in supporting the channel. You can also find that I've opened up a merch store for the channel. My Teespring link is down there, and you can pick up my Peekaboo Victor tee, art made by the inimitable Milkshake, aka Miljami, if you're interested in having Victor crawl out of your chest and wave hello. Well, once again, thank you for being here, and I'll see you for the next one.